think I might have humans tonight that come to me cause I'm coming to you. I think I might have you for a bite. I'm gonna cook me up some He-Man stew, cause transvestites can be cannibals too. And I'll feel better after I eat you, cause I hate people when they're not polite. If you end up on my table then it serves you right. And when I was young, I wore my sister's clothes.
Male intimacy is something which is only allowed to exist in specific scenarios. The genre of horror is one that often provides those scenarios. Other factors, like extreme isolation or being in active military service, also provide for male intimacy chances due to the separation from typical society that both present. So, what if we combine those together? Both Ravenous 1999 and The Terror 2018 are survival horror pieces with supernatural elements that occur in cold, isolated places full of military men in the late 1840s. But their approaches to male intimacy and homoeroticism are very different. Before we examine that, however, we need to think about martial manhood was a concept that arose in the first half of the 19th century to replace earlier Victorian gender norms. Honestly, it could be the topic of a video essay all on its own, but I'll be brief. American in origin, martial manhood and its counterpart, restrained manhood, had fully cemented themselves as movements by the time of the Mexican-American War, when both of these pieces take place. The fulfillment of martial manhood required toughness, honor, keeping a cool head, and being able to both dish out and take a beating. Both of these versions of masculinity can be subverted, but only in certain ways, following certain rules. In military service, quote, comradeship was meant to sustain the soldier, to provide the possibility for heroic action, to redeem the horrific suffering that the war endlessly inflicted, unquote. Separate from the rest of society, soldiers undergo extreme hardship and are forced to find companionship in one another. Without the imposition of societal rules, groups of people will discard rules that are less practical or necessary. This is known as cultural drift in the face of social isolation. In the case of soldiers, morale is necessary to keep an army going. The preservation of that morale will inevitably be deemed of greater import than adherence to social values that cannot be enforced in the same manner so far from home. In the case of geographical isolation, most often the necessity of survival will overcome social taboos. We first see Ravenous's protagonist, Captain John Boyd, in the middle of the Mexican-American War after his battalion has been fiercely attacked by the Mexican army. As a soldier, a captain especially, Boyd should be the perfect example of martial manhood, but he isn't.
I froze. I was scared. I played dead.
Then, according to Boyd,
something had changed.
The blood from his fellow braver soldiers that Boyd had accidentally swallowed transferred the bravery of the dead men it came from without Boyd realizing, pushing him to take the command post. Through his previous cowardice, he had failed to fulfill martial manhood, and he instead had to take it from those who had clearly fulfilled it in order to have it himself. Homosexuality, or as they call it in The Terror, sodomy, is also an unsanctioned breach of martial manhood. It's worse than cowardice because it quote-unquote infects other men. In episode 2 of The Terror, Cornelius Hickey and Billy Gibson are caught having sex by a lieutenant in the ship's hold. Gibson, afraid of the consequences, tells the lieutenant that Hickey had pressured him into it, believing that the lie would save him face with command. This results in Hickey later being confronted by the lieutenant for his alleged crime. On the other hand, Terror shows when men are allowed to toe the line of masculinity, when it's a joke. During the carnival scene, some of the men don dresses, which would normally be a completely unsanctioned breach of the social norms. However, because it is meant to be a time of joviality and lightness for the men, their actions are excused. It is this masculine milieu which we must keep in mind for the rest of this video. The only canonized queer relationships in these pieces of media are both in The Terror. Implied queerness is abundant, and interpretation is a ripe field, but it can only get us so far. Terror provides two very different queer relationships, that of Hickey and Gibson, and that of Peglar and Bridgens. Clearly, Hickey and Gibson have a sexual relationship. It is repeatedly established to be a two-way relationship that is not only consented to, but actively desired by both parties. This is not simply a pairing of convenience, but the presence of genuine desire between the two sailors. Despite Gibson officially ending the relationship after its discovery by the lieutenant, the dynamic between the two lingers. Despite Hickey's general demeanor, he does listen to Gibson more than some of the others. In fact, it is Gibson, not Hickey, who suggests starting a mutiny, even though Hickey takes point. In return, Gibson follows Hickey until his inevitable death, which comes at Hickey's hands. Despite Gibson having put his standing with command above his relationship with Hickey, he still follows Hickey until the end. Peglar and Bridgens are canonically in a relationship in the original book, one that lasts the entirety of their time together, unlike Hickey and Gibson's, though it isn't as clear in the show. Expanding our scope to behind-the-scenes information, showrunner David Kajanich has, in interviews, compared Peglar and Bridgens' relationship to that of Hickey and Gibson. During the event colloquially known as Davechella, Kajanich made custom playlists for a variety of the main cast of characters. The final song in Bridgens' playlist is The Secret Marriage by Hans Eisler. Altogether, this is compelling enough evidence to conclude that the two are still together in the show. Peglar and Bridgens' relationship demonstrates the aforementioned cultural drift, where certain social rules fall to the wayside. When Peglar collapses from a combination of lead poisoning and scurvy, Bridgens holds him in the manner of a lover, in full view of the men. The men can feel the intimacy, and yet there is no later confrontation regarding the evils of sodomy, like there was with Hickey and Gibson. In their harsh reality, every comfort is carved out and fought for. The threat of sodomy is nothing when facing starvation. While Terror was originally aired in 2018, Ravenous was released in 1999. Acceptability of on-screen queer relationships was in a much different place. As such, Ravenous uses allusions to suggest the sexual relationship between Boyd and Ives, rather than textually stating it. The YouTuber ScaredyCats presents this wonderfully in their video essay on the movie, which I highly recommend. To begin with, after Ives has successfully taken over the post in the Sierra Nevadas and turned the rest of the men against Boyd, he attempts to lure Boyd into joining him in his cannibal lifestyle. In order to keep Boyd with him during this time, he chains Boyd to the bed. Now, to clarify, I don't think this movie is in any way trying to say that homosexuality is bad or inherently predatory. I very much agree with ScaredyCats' take, that it is more so a metaphor for how queer people can be trapped into unhealthy relationships due to their isolation from society. However, I think we can all agree that this scene is reminiscent of a BDSM or kink scene, two things historically very tied to the queer community. It's also just a very sexually charged scene. I mean, look at this. The power dynamic is insane. And the allusion to sex gets even more intense with the final battle between Boyd and Ives. The two men end up trapped in a giant bear trap pressed together front to front. They are exhausted and panting, and since this is a college class, I think we can all gather what this looks like. I don't need to spell it out for you. Ives says that they will die together, and wonders which one of them will eat the other, which we will elaborate on later. But before we do, Terror has an advantage over Ravenous once again in this category. Firstly, its longer runtime of roughly 10 hours gives it much longer to establish and explore relationships than Ravenous, which is only an hour 40. I can't possibly fit all examples of intimacy in this video essay, so I have picked a few specific ones to share with you. Secondly, Ravenous came out in 1999. The kind of intimacy shown in Terror is much more acceptable to portray now than it was in the late 90s. It's become much more common now to see male characters get to have vulnerable moments with each other and not be shamed for it. Terror also has the advantage of including the character of Harry Goodsir. I love this man so much. Goodsir is the anatomist of the expedition, and eventually, after Carnival, the closest thing they have to a doctor. Our first glimpse of Goodsir is when a young sailor is dying in the first episode. Goodsir sticks by the sailor, providing him with great comfort in his final hours. Additionally, he promises to deliver the boy's ring to his sister. He doesn't get to, for various reasons, but it demonstrates his character as being kind and comforting. Death is a very intimate process, especially when someone is young and very sick and afraid. Providing reassurance during that process is an intimate act of kindness. Later on, after the fire at Carnival, Goodsir speaks with Collins about the experience, which has clearly had a heavy effect on Collins. He feels betrayed by his body's natural response to the smell of cooking meat after so long starving, even though the meat is his friend's. The traumatic moment has made him extremely vulnerable, and Goodsir is there to provide someone to lean on. When Collins confesses that he's tried talking to someone about what happened, but it didn't help, Goodsir tells him,
Well, you haven't tried with me.
as mentioned at the beginning of the essay, intense isolation in combination with severe circumstances drives people to break social norms and taboos for the sake of survival. The greatest act of devotion is to give oneself over wholly. That happens in both pieces of media through the act of cannibalism, both consensually and non-consensually. In both cases, cannibalism is used as a metaphor for interpersonal relationships. Additionally, cannibalism in The Terror serves an important narrative purpose, demonstrating the lengths we go to in times of extreme necessity. The metaphor is exemplified in Captain James Fitzjames's death scene. Fitzjames's last request to Crozier is to use his body to feed the men. Earlier in the show, Fitzjames is shown to be arrogant and boastful, repeatedly telling the same story of how he was wounded in China. That scar later comes back to kill him as it opens up during scurvy. Throughout the course of the show, circumstances and hardship force Fitzjames to abandon his mask of superiority and stop holding himself apart from the other sailors. The border between command and enlisted breaks down as more and more people die. Fitzjames gives more and more of himself to his men until his death scene. Even in death, he wishes to be given to the men. This solidifies Fitzjames's arc and provides narrative resolution. Fitzjames at the beginning would have been more focused on receiving a proper burial, as he was with Sir John. But this Fitzjames thinks first about the survival of his men. On the other hand, Ives's cannibalism is purely selfish in nature. Throughout Ravenous, it is established that consuming someone else is a method of taking their strength and vitality. When Ives attempts to lure Boyd into eating some of his people's soup with him, he is trying to get Boyd to indulge in his cannibalistic lifestyle where he takes advantage of others. Ives has been living a lonely life and desires connection. Since Boyd has already consumed human blood, there's no going back for him, making him Ives's ideal candidate. Close relationships provide not only refuge, but strength to those in them. To quote Sarah Cole's article, Modernism, Male Intimacy, and the Great War, so self-sustaining are these bands of men, and so mutually intertwined at the level of both body and identity, that their community seems provocatively to challenge ideological norms governing civilian conduct. Ives is taking that intimacy and bastardizing it to provide himself with strength. Unlike Fitzjames, Ives uses the dependence of the military structure to bolster himself. He takes advantage of the already present intimacy inherent to the scenario. Overall, the differences in portrayal of male intimacy between the two pieces are demonstrative of not only the narrative ways in which it can be used, but also of the larger cultural perception of male intimacy at the time that the media was released. 1999 was a very different world than 2018. Horror allows the pushing of boundaries, making it a way for creators to explore what is and isn't acceptable. And yet, horror cannot fully escape the time that it is created in.